In 1940, on the northern coast of France, the port city of Dunkirk had become a place of desperation. British and Allied troops waited on the beaches, trapped between the advancing German army and the cold waters of the Channel. As ships arrived to rescue as many men as possible, hard choices were made. And some soldiers were simply left behind. In the spring of 1940, Europe was already deep in the turmoil of war. German forces had swept through the Low Countries with surprising speed, driving the British Expeditionary Force and their French allies steadily backward. Town after town fell under the pressure of the German advance. For many soldiers, the retreat did not feel like a tactical maneuver. It felt like being pushed toward the edge of the continent, with nowhere left to go. Dunkirk, a coastal town in northern France, became the final gathering point. The beaches stretched wide and flat, exposed to the gray sky and the constant threat from above. There were no forests for cover, no hills for protection, only sand, sea, and uncertainty. Soldiers arrived in fragmented units, some exhausted from days without rest, others still dazed from sudden battles where friends had disappeared into smoke and confusion. They lined up with quiet discipline, forming lines that seemed to reach into the distance. For many, the war had begun with speeches, uniforms, and confidence. But here, near Dunkirk, the reality was simple: survive long enough to leave. Orders filtered through the ranks. There would be an evacuation across the English Channel. Ships of all kinds would come. The goal was to bring as many men home as possible. No one knew how many that would be. No one was certain how long the beach could be held. The atmosphere was marked not by noise, but by waiting. Soldiers spoke in low voices, if at all. Some wrote letters that might never be delivered. Others simply stared toward the horizon, looking for ships. The days were punctuated by distant artillery and sudden air raids. Each explosion reminded them that time was running out. And yet, the sea moved at its own pace, indifferent to plans and fear. Behind the visible organization of queues and formations, there were unspoken truths. Vehicles had been abandoned. Weapons were left in the sand. Commanders had to choose which units would move first, and which would wait. Not everyone would fit on the ships. Not every position could be defended. Some men already sensed what this meant. In a war that demanded sacrifice, decisions would be made that left certain soldiers standing on the beach, watching others depart. This was the beginning of the story, not of victory or defeat, but of being left behind. As the evacuation began, the beaches of Dunkirk turned into a place of constant motion and unresolved tension. Columns of soldiers slowly advanced toward the water, only to wait again on wooden piers or directly in the shallows. The Royal Navy worked together with civilian vessels, forming a fragile lifeline across the channel. Every departure brought hope. Every delay reminded those still on shore that space was limited. The organization of men became more deliberate. Units were separated. Wounded soldiers were moved forward when possible, their bandages darkened with sand and seawater. Engineers destroyed abandoned vehicles to keep them from enemy hands, filling the coastline with the smell of burning oil. Paperwork, maps, and equipment were discarded in haste. The war that had once felt orderly now unfolded with quiet improvisation. Air attacks arrived without warning. German aircraft crossed the sky, dropping bombs that sent men scattering across the open beach. Craters formed where formations had been standing only moments earlier. Then, just as suddenly, silence returned. Soldiers brushed the sand from their coats and stepped back into line. There were no speeches, no dramatic gestures, only the discipline of men who understood that movement meant survival. Officers met repeatedly, reviewing lists and orders. Some units were told to hold the perimeter, buying time for others to escape. For those assigned to defensive positions, The meaning of their role was unspoken but clear. They were to remain until evacuation was no longer possible. Their presence kept the beaches functioning. Their delay allowed ships to load and depart. Among the ranks, rumors began to circulate. Some believed that everyone would eventually leave. Others sensed the truth, that evacuation required choices, and choices meant exclusion. Soldiers looked toward the sea and calculated the distance, the number of ships, the speed of return. They understood that the arithmetic was unforgiving. Nightfall brought its own uncertainty. The beaches faded into shadow, illuminated only by distant fires and the faint lights of ships. Men slept briefly on the sand, rifles resting beside them. The tide washed close to their boots and retreated again, as if marking the slow passage of time. In the darkness, the question remained constant: who would board the next vessel, and who would still be here when dawn arrived? The plan continued. The evacuation expanded. And step by step, the number of men on the beach began to thin. But not evenly. Not completely. Some soldiers realized that their turn might never come. In the final days of the evacuation, the separation between those who would leave and those who would remain became unmistakable. Orders were issued with increasing clarity. Certain units were designated to embark. Others were told to hold their positions for just a little longer. That phrase, "a little longer," stretched into something larger than time. It became a boundary between departure and abandonment. The perimeter around Dunkirk narrowed. Defensive lines shifted closer to the town as German forces advanced. Soldiers dug shallow positions in the sand or sheltered behind fragments of seawall. They fired when necessary, but the purpose was no longer to win the ground. It was to delay, to slow, to allow more bodies to reach the ships. Each hour gained meant lives saved somewhere out on the beach. Ships continued to arrive, though in smaller numbers. Men were rushed aboard, sometimes under fire, sometimes in uneasy calm. Those still on land watched the vessels grow smaller on the horizon. They tried not to count them. They tried not to measure distance. But the calculation remained in their minds. One more ship meant hope, one fewer meant something else entirely. At a certain moment, unmarked by ceremony or announcement, the shift became undeniable. The flow of men toward the water slowed. The queues shortened. Officers spoke quietly among themselves. Lists were checked, then set aside. The evacuation was nearing its limit. The decision, once abstract, now existed in the bodies of the soldiers who still stood on the shore. Some men were told directly that they would not be leaving. Others understood without being told. They gathered what little equipment they still carried. They adjusted their uniforms with the simple discipline of routine. There were no dramatic gestures, no raised voices. Only the silent acknowledgement of a role that now felt final. Air raids and distant artillery framed the scene but did not define it. What remained most striking was the stillness. Soldiers looked toward the sea as the last ships faded into the mist and darkness. The sound of engines diminished. Waves continued to break against the sand. For those left behind, the coastline became both a boundary and a witness. The perimeter collapsed inward. Communication lines faded. Some men were captured while still at their posts. Others were taken in small groups, exhausted and resigned. What had begun as a mass movement now dissolved into scattered encounters along roads, dunes, and ruined buildings. There was no single moment that marked the end. No final signal. Just the gradual realization that the evacuation was over, and that they were still here, on the same beach, under the same gray sky, with the sea now offering nothing more than distance. This was the point at which the story could not be changed. The men who remained had fulfilled their orders. And yet, in the larger memory of war, their presence would fade. When the evacuation ended, the beaches at Dunkirk slowly emptied of movement. The lines of soldiers were gone. The ships had vanished beyond the horizon. What remained were scattered footprints in the sand, abandoned helmets, and the distant echo of engines that would not return. The men who had been left behind were now separated from the great movement of rescue. Their story no longer followed the crowd. It narrowed into smaller, quieter scenes. Captured soldiers were marched away in groups. Some walked in silence, others spoke only in brief sentences, as if words themselves were heavy. They passed the places where they had waited, now stripped of purpose. The sea continued to roll in and out, uninterested in what had happened along its edge. The wind erased their tracks one gust at a time. In reports and records, the evacuation was soon described in terms of numbers: how many had been saved, how many ships had crossed, how many days it had taken. The men who stayed behind were present in those figures, but only as entries in a column. Their individual names disappeared into paperwork, stored away in offices far from the beach where they had stood. Time moved forward. The war continued in new locations, with new battles and new headlines. Dunkirk remained important, but not in the same way for everyone. The story that was remembered focused on survival, escape, and the journey home. The soldiers who had been left behind became quieter within that narrative, like distant voices carried away by the wind. Years later, the beach looked ordinary again. Tourists walked along the sand. Fishing boats returned to the harbor. The landscape did not explain what had taken place there. No single object remained to point to the exact spot where a soldier once waited for a ship that never came. Their presence existed only in fragments, in letters never sent, in diaries that stopped mid-sentence, in fading photographs where faces stare into an uncertain distance. The memory of those men did not disappear all at once. It faded slowly, absorbed by time, by other stories, by the natural tendency of history to move toward what is visible and victorious. Their role had been essential, yet their experience was not the one most often told. They had delayed, defended, and remained. And then they were no longer on the beach. They became prisoners, or statistics, or unnamed figures in the background of larger events. What endures is not a conclusion, but a lingering absence. A quiet stretch of coastline. A gray horizon. And the knowledge that, for some soldiers at Dunkirk in 1940, the story did not continue across the channel. It simply faded from view, until forgetting became part of history itself. If this story mattered to you, consider subscribing. More forgotten history is coming.